What's up guys? Today I'm going to talk to you about the progression and regression model that we use in our Standout PT program to help personal trainers choose the right exercises for the right person at the right time when it comes to their programming in the gym. Obviously, progression and regression models are really important to be able to get the most out of your client and their training. So progression obviously means making the lift harder in one way, shape or another, and then regressions making the movement easier in one way or another. There's lots of different reasons that we do that. So this video is specifically about why we would implement a progression and regression model, why it's so important. And then in the next video, we'll actually go through practical applications of how to apply it as well. So the first thing that we need to talk about when it comes to progression and regression models is the key component to all things that we do within training someone, whether it's like the execution of a movement or even just the programming. And that's the SAID principle. So specific adaptation to imposed demand. As a trainer, you need to know the three main targeted adaptations for training. The first one's going to be intramuscular coordination. So in other words, how effective is that muscle at producing force? This is usually targeted by using loads around 85% of our 1 rep max or more. Intermuscular coordination is actually about how all the muscles work together and how efficient they are and effective they are at producing force as a unit. So think about intramuscular coordination is like how much force can my bicep create. Intermuscular coordination is more like how much force can my bicep create with some upwards intention and making my whole arm to get my hand to move at a certain speed. Training this is going to be really anywhere from 40 up to 70% of your 1 RM. And it's important to know that there's a lot of overlap between those two, around that kind of 70 and 85% mark, which is why you'll see most programs will exist, strength programs in particular, where you need a lot of skill and you need a lot of force production in something like powerlifting, for example, where most athletes will spend a lot of time in that zone. Whereas for clients, we need a little bit more considerate of like building skill is going to take probably a lot less load. Once we've got some skill, we want to train it further and learn how to produce force. We're probably training in slightly higher percentages. Hypertrophy, most of our clients want to look better as well. So hypertrophy is going to be really important. This is basically increasing the size of the muscle. So the bigger a muscle is, the more force it can produce and the better it can work in unison with everything else. Building muscle is going to happen anywhere between 40 and 80% of 1 RM is the general load range that we train. Remembering that proximity to failure is going to be very important. And our progression regression model ties into proximity to failure a lot. So all of these variations require a certain level of proximity to failure. If you're selecting an exercise that's too difficult from a skill standpoint that your client can't actually execute, you're not getting into that proximity of failure you need to actually get the outcomes you want from that training. Now we need to consider the main movement types. So we've split these up. You've probably heard different variations of this before. We talk about the prime movement. So that's usually the big banger. We kind of tend to talk about the powerlifting lifts in this. So like a low bar squat, deadlift, and a bench press. There's a few other ones you could include as well, things like military presses and that type of thing. Accessories are lifts that closely mimic the prime lift and give great carryover while reducing the level of fatigue, complexity, and difficulty. Those will include like safety squat bar squats, close grip bench press, RDLs, pull-ups, those kind of things that mimic what we're trying to achieve, allow us to practice a skill, but create overall less fatigue, improve skill and force production, and even hypertrophy as well. That'll help us down the road. Compound, so multi-joint movements. Most people have heard of compound movements before. All prime and accessory movements are technically a compound movement, but we're going to take that a little bit more specifically and define it as not being connected to the main lift itself. So for example, like a walking lunge does have some carryover to the prime lift, but it's not the same thing. We need to consider that the skill carryover is going to be slightly different there compared to a full doing a safety bar squat. Then we have isolation, so single joint movements, not directly connected with the main lift again, but they're going to help over the long run, primarily more than likely through hypertrophy rather than skill or intermuscular coordination, because we're really trying to train one muscle group most of the time with this. So leg extensions, pec flies, lying hamstrings and stuff like that. They still have their place in producing strength. If your goal is hypertrophy, they probably make up more of your program than a strength client. So important to be able to identify those. Finally, you need to know why you would use each of these exercises. The prime lifts. While you might use low loads in a prime lift, most often the goal is to train intermuscular coordination here. So that's producing maximum amount of force. You do this with the intent to express or prepare to express strength. So if you're a bodybuilder, there's not a lot of point going up to over 80% 1RM because you're not planning on actually maximizing the force output of your musculature very often. If you're a powerlifter or you're strength testing for whatever reason for your Gen Pop client who wants to get stronger, then maybe we need to think about this. Accessories and compound lifts. These lifts elicit less systemic fatigue, which means you can do more of them and build more volume in your training. And it's plausible to use loads anywhere from 40 to 90%, but most of the time we're going to spend kind of between 60 and 85% range, which is, we kind of know that kind of 6 to 12 reps that seems to magically get the best results with our clients who have general base goals. This creates a spread of positive outcomes across all three of those adaptations. We get a little bit of force production, we get a lot of skill development, we get a lot of hypertrophy provided we're going to that proximity of failure. And we're really happy in that zone, but obviously creates a little bit of fatigue. Isolation, you're here to drive hypertrophy. All right, you're not really chasing the skill on a leg extension. You're here to get hypertrophy, so you're trying to maximize the amount of tension through that muscle and just train it as hard as you can. All these factors and picking where the right space for your client is going to be based on their goals, their phase of training, their primary goals and outcomes. And you can progress and regress movements based on your knowledge of the client, their abilities and their goals. You can turn the dial up when you need to, and you can turn the dial down when you need to on specific outcomes based on what's in front of you in terms of the client. Now, the second reason we need to use progression and regression model is the skill acquisition deficiency. So we've got a breakdown in our client's lift and we need to address it. So that breakdown we've identified comes from skill. So what skill? Well, if technique is the ability to perform a rep within the agreed parameters, then skill is the ability to do it effectively and consistently under load. So doing an exercise when your client doesn't have the proper skill, it's a waste of time and energy for you and for them. They're not reaching that proximity to failure they need to actually get the training outcomes we've been talking about today. And you're going to spend all this time queuing, and you might feel great. They might even feel great that like, hey, I'm getting all this cool, like fancy queuing. I'm actually making any real progress week to week. It's getting quite frustrating when I'm seeing someone else just smashing out. Maybe something that's slightly easier, but actually making some progress. So it's better to actually regress the exercise in this case so you can build some skill that will carry over to that primary lift. So let's say, for example, you can walking lunge to a decent capacity. Can do that, but you can't necessarily safety squat just yet. So let's do our walking lunges, build some capacity, build some strength, build some proprioception, some skill, maybe some hypertrophy. And then over time, I'm going to be able to do a safety bar squat based on everything that I built with the walking lunge. Or I could spend hours and hours and hours on the safety bar with my coach trying to get me into the right positions and execute well, and still all the while never actually achieving a proximity of failure that allows me to trigger the responses that I want, not really progressing the way that I would like. I can only access one training adaptation, which is skill, versus I can get skill, hypertrophy, and force production from something like a walking lunge or the regressed exercise of choice. Next thing to look at is a strength deficiency. Typically with a skill breakdown, the way we would see that is like not all reps are bad. So if you can do it, if I can correct you into doing a good rep and then sometimes you do a shit, that's probably going to be based on skill. Strength, on the other hand, is going to be based on you just aren't strong enough to do it. So that's going to trigger by a certain amount of load, or it also can come from a little bit of fatigue. Load's really easy. If you put the load up and a consistent breakdown happens in form or in technique, then we can say, well, that is a breakdown in strength in that area. Might be a strength in your brace, might be upper back, might be legs, might be whatever. So we identify that and then we can go and solve it with a regression that targets that area. Fatigue-based strength failure is a little bit different. It can be tricky because sometimes it's based on our mental capacity or endurance. When we've increased the load and we're doing too many reps and I'm just not concentrating anymore, I'm tired and I'm not executing as well. So in this situation, we're looking to progress or regress probably volume rather than exercise. Or if you're trying to target, say, conditioning, and your client doesn't actually have the skill set to maintain good technique and proximity to failure in that exercise based on their current conditioning, you need to select a better exercise for them to pursue that goal. The best way to test this, because sometimes as they get tired, they'll lose skill, is if you can cue and improve a lift, it's at the same load, it's going to be a skill deficiency. If you can't cue it out and the same thing keeps happening, it's more than likely going to be strength-based. There's one last breakdown that we're going to talk about in this video today before we get into the application side, which is in the next video, and that's talking about dysfunction or pain. So dysfunction or pain fall outside the scope of personal trainers. We can't really address those too much, but we can spot them and we can refer out to allied health professionals and work with them using our progression and regression model to create an effective transition to improving it. So how do we determine a dysfunction? Typically it means no matter the load or the cueing or whatever happens, that we have the exact same problem happen over and over again. Some trainers may have some tools that they're able to investigate those. So techniques that they use to increase ankle mobility, for example, if we've got rotation in a squat due to the ankle not being able to go through the right amount of flexion. You might be able to introduce something that helps that over time, but it's probably better just to refer out and get some confirmation, helps the client with buy-in, believe in the process and apply it a little bit better anyway. So all we've looked at today is the said principle. So remember what you're actually trying to achieve with the exercise that's in front of you. Then consider the deficiencies that might pop up. So the first one's going to be a skill deficiency. The next one's going to be a strength deficiency or a dysfunction and pain. Why is this exercise breaking down in front of you? When you can determine why, then you can apply the correct regression to allow that client to get those outcomes. Again, said principle that you're looking for to either bring them up to the lift that you're targeting or just achieve the outcomes that you're trying to achieve in a different way with a different movement. Helpful for you guys, we've defined why it's so important to have a good, consistent progression regression model for your clients when you're programming. In the next article, we're going to talk about how to get it into practice. If you want to find out more, go and check out the STCfit Learning podcast, where we do have episodes where we talk specifically about progressing and regressing exercises. We'll drop the link into that exact episode in the bio below.